Welcome to the SACNA Student Programs webinar series. Today's webinar is on grant writing for the graduate students. My name is Katerina Oviedo, and I'm the SACNA Students Programs Manager. I'm coming to you from the original homelands of the Kumeyaay tribe in San Diego, California. We also have Emily Public, SACNA's team member, who is in our chat moderator for today. SACNAS is a fully inclusive organization dedicated to achieving true diversity in STEM. As the nation's largest multicultural and multidisciplinary STEM diversity organization, SACNAS creates space where all members, volunteers, and partners feel they belong and can embrace their intersectional identities. SACNAS is based out of California, which is the original homeland to over 200 tribal nations, bands, and rancherias of the Native American indigenous people. We would like to take this time to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the various regions, which will all live, work, and honor the rich culture of the indigenous people across the country. It is our pleasure to coordinate and host this informative and educational webinars. For today's presentation, our panelists will be discussing how it is to best prepare to start writing a grant, where are the best resources there to support you in the process, and much more. We will also be accepting live questions, so please submit them via the chat. So now it is my pleasure to introduce today's panelist. Dr. Elizabeth Gonzalez is Nuu-Savvy Mixtec migrant, scholar, practitioner, and social justice leader. Dr. Gonzalez is unwavering in her commitment to eliminate and undo the impact of systematic inequity in higher education by bringing research and praxis. Dr. Gonzalez has strengthened institutional capacity to close racial equity gaps in student success outcomes through her various roles. She has been responsible for managing multiple Hispanic serving institution initiatives, grants at San Diego City College, UC Santa Cruz, and San Jose City College. She has collaborated with colleagues and external campus partners to author successful federal grants awards, including a $3 million Developing HSI Title V grant from the U.S. Department of Education. Our next speaker is Dr. Shreya Ahavan, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name, is an assistant professor in biomedical engineering at Texas A&M University and an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Nanomedicine at Houston Methodist Research Institute. Dr. Ravan directs her lab to research all things surrounding the cancer stem cell immune axis in metastatic cancers. When she's not working, she enjoys reading a good book, cooking, taking on baking projects beyond her amateur skills with her children, and hiking. Our next speaker is Dr. Erica Moore, is the inaugural Rising Star Assistant Professor in the Department of Materials Science and Engineering at the University of Florida. As a Black woman, Erica is a passionate advocate for professional development and financial literacy. She's the founder and president of More Wealth, Inc., a nonprofit created to empower students in financial literacy. Recently acknowledged as Forbes 30 Under 30 in the healthcare category. Her notable awards include the NIH KL2 Training Grant and a Space Research Initiative Grant, the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship, and the Ford Foundation Predoctoral Fellowship. And our last speaker for today is Elisa Vogt, received a bachelor's in biology from St. Mary's University and participated in the South Texas Doctoral Bridge Program at Texas State University before starting graduate school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. To support her research, she was awarded an NIH training grant appointment, Bar of Welcome Fund Graduate Diversity Enrichment Program Award, and was nominated for the HHMI Gilliam Fellowship. Thank you to all our speakers for making the time to be with us today and to discuss the grant writing topic. I would like to start this conversation with our first question. how to best prepare to start writing a grant.
Thank you so much. I think I'll start and then I'll ask my fellow panelists to weigh in. Okay, so I think the best way to start writing a grant is after you've identified the proposal that you want to go for, the fellowship that you might want to get. I usually start by doing like my background research. And so I usually ask people who've gotten a grant, oh, can I read your examples? Can you tell me more about the application process, and just trying to learn and gain background knowledge about the proposal so that I can start like preparing it in my mind. One thing I always ask is, if I can get your application example, but also if they would be willing to read my application when I was done with it to give me feedback. So I'm both getting their background knowledge and trying to get them to apply their expertise as I try to write my own fellowship or my own grant application.
Yeah, so I wholeheartely agree with trying to connect with people who have also applied, and I mean, even better if they've been awarded it. And I definitely feel like I leaned into my graduate student cohort and even the older students to get advice. Although I think one of the best pieces of advice that I got when asking for an example is to not compare myself to this application. Most applications, especially for graduate students, are very personal. They involve your journey and your specific expertise and experiences that are coming to make you an independent and unique candidate. And so using those as examples, but not as like the golden compass to direct you. Yeah, it's very, very helpful to have an example.
So once you've identified examples and know what it looks like, I think for me, the biggest hindrance or stumbling block is to actually start writing. And so I tell myself, and I remind myself a lot of times that my first draft does not have to be perfect. I just have to brain dump on paper or, Word document, and I will put everything that is in my head, good, bad, mediocre thoughts, everything that I can on a document, and then I will have started the process. And I think that is usually a big stumbling block for me, because I tell myself, oh, I'm going to finish reading all the background that I need to finish reading. I'm going to read examples, and usually oftentimes I will use background research and reading other examples as very good procrastination tools to start writing. And so I will say, just your first draft does not have to be perfect. It just has to be words on paper. And, that's a great way to also just start writing.
And if I may add, I think it's really important, even before you've identified the funding source, doing the work so that when you arrive to the point where you are ready to start writing, you have done a lot of work in making sure that you're applying to something that is actually a good fit with the project that you're about to propose. So I think it's important for us to discuss how you came about picking this funding source. That is going to be a critical phase. So what I tell people is early on, start identifying grants that you might want to apply to in 2 years, in 3 years. So then you're building yourself up to apply for things in the future. And you take your time making sure that you're applying to an agency that is aligned and is a good fit for what project you're going to propose. I wouldn't want you to skip that phase. I call it the exploration phase. Who are going to be your sponsors? Who are going to be your funders? Whose logo are you going to carry proudly? And think about that phase. And then once you said, hey, I want to get an NSF grant, or I want to get the Ford Fellowship, or I want to get, Cora Robles Fellowship. Doing the work to, like my colleague said, getting examples. I would also say if you can reach out to a program officer, somebody who usually is available to screen proposals. So usually they'll take a 1-page abstract, or they're willing to meet with you if you have ideas. I would say try to schedule something like that prior to even getting writing started. Once you actually start the writing, I always tell people, never open a blank page. I never open a blank page. Usually I have stuff that I've already written. So for example, when I was in my first year of grad school, I was applying to the Ford Fellowship. So I took my grad school application and recycled a lot of that. And that was my starting document. And that way I wasn't staring at a blank page, right? Or you could copy and paste from other sources that you're writing. So that's what I always tell people is recycle that you've already written. And that'll just at least get the juices going.
Thank you
Yeah.
for this valuable information. Yes, Lucy.
I didn't want to interrupt Elizabeth, but I think that I definitely have had a lot of fear starting with a blank page. It is very intimidating to say, okay, here I go. This is like all on me to craft something that's going to be brilliant. And I think Shreya commented on this earlier, is like your first draft does not have to be perfect, but that does not stop you from worrying that your first draft is absolutely terrible. And like, what are people going to think when I share this with them? I don't know, for me, I can't stop that, but I recycled so much of my graduate student application, as well as even like, if you're first or second year, even just kind of highlighting titles from slides, like from lab meeting, where I'm like, you know, my conclusions, or, you know, kind of data points that are like, wow, I did this, I got this, you know, nice piece of interesting data. Even just having that as a guiding point to, yeah, I think also to just ground you that you're applying for a reason, you have this basis to help you not start from a completely blank slate, which can be hard.
Thank you. We have a question that came in. I have never written a grant proposal or even know where to begin. However, I'm curious to know, what points do you absolutely want to be sure you make in the proposal?
Yeah, two things come to mind is when I was in grad school, I mean, I was applying to fellowships even, you know, early on, even before going to grad school, I had to apply for fellowships as I was getting admitted to graduate school. And so, you know, fellowships, I mean, they're not grants, but they are a funding source, right? So I think I want to include that in our discussion. The Ford Fellowship was also another funding source. Again, not necessarily a like research grant, but it is a funding source. So those applications, right, it's very clear what they want in your proposals. So they usually want a personal statement, things like that. For federal funding sources, they have guidelines. And so what I tell people is stick to the guidelines, because literally, and I've been a reviewer for, you know, the humanities and the US Department of Ed. So we really have a rubric, and we're going through every single item and scoring a proposal based on that rubric. So most funding sources will put a call for funding proposals, and they will be very clear as to what the proposal has to have. So I would say follow that to the T. Don't try to get too creative as to the structure, because they have a rubric that they're using to score the proposals. And then my second piece of advice is look for courses at your institution that focus on grant writing. So I took a grant writing course at UC Santa Cruz when I was a graduate student there. I think I took it my first year. And that was really helpful. If I'm sure, I mean, assuming we're all at an institution where you can find a grant writing course within your department, if not within a similar department, a neighbor department. So I would encourage students to look at that and invest in developing that skill, either through a course or books. I don't have a book that I would recommend, but if anybody else here has, again, purchase a book to help you with that, I guess, with some of that. But again, everything, the structure is going to be dependent on the funding agency.
Yes, that's awesome. I typed up some of those responses so that way people can take Elizabeth's piece of advice and apply it. The other thing that I was going to say, now, depending on which mechanism like if you're applying for a fellowship grant applications, for example, the NSF-GRFP, the National Science Foundation's Graduate Research Fellowship Program, or even the American Heart Association's pre-doctoral fellowship, those fellowships and grants are really focused on who you are as an individual and the context of your science. So one thing that like I always tell people when they start preparing these fellowships is to think about how they are positioning or persuading reviewers on their behalf. And so this is something that a lot of people don't get, because sometimes people assume there's this dichotomy between like scientific writing and persuasive writing. But in my opinion, the most effective grant writers are people who understand that there's no difference. Like if you are going to write a strong proposal, your proposal needs to be persuasive. And in this case, if it's a fellowship, for you as an individual and or for your science. So you basically have to figure out, why should people care? They've read 7 other applications. Why should you be the one that sticks in the bottom of their mind? You know, like, so trying to answer those questions, that's like a fundamental aspect of writing a grant proposal that I think a lot of people kind of miss. They're just like, oh, it's just I'm just telling them the science, they're gonna care. That's not the case most of the time. So think about it within the context of persuasion. You're trying to persuade your reviewer to really want to fund you, to fund your research. That's one thing that I think is like a fundamental background for writing proposals. Shreya?
Yeah, I want to add that persuasive writing, if you can also tailor it to whoever you're applying to, likely has a vision for what they want to fund. And they will outline that vision on their website or in their program announcement. And so as much as you can, if you can reflect on how what you're proposing meets that mission and vision, and how your identity and your work and your proposed work will align with that, if you can make that connection, that is also going to be viewed very strongly. So NIH or NSF have completely different missions for what they will fund. And so, you know, you have to keep in mind when you're applying, what do they want to fund, and how does your work align with their funding mission?
I wanted to kind of add my perspective on what Dr. Moore mentioned, because it was probably my number 1 tip, is the mental aspect. And I'm a psychologist, so obviously, you know, that's my first thought, is like, before you do any of this work, you have to believe in yourself and in the project that you're proposing. You have to come in there believing, I am going to be successful at either earning this degree or getting this project going. And I'm just looking for sponsors, and I'm inviting people to sponsor this project that I already know is going to be successful. So then you're changing the mentality from like, oh, I'm asking people for money, right? Versus I'm inviting people to sponsor a project that's going to be successful and that they're going to be proud to put their logo on. So you really have to change that mindset, because then I think everything else will be a little easier, and it'll show in your persuasive argument that they really want to sponsor this project because you believe that this is going to be successful. So just kind of wanted to add that I also think that that's a really, really important aspect of this, is the psychological aspect of believing in yourself.
Thank you, Liz. Okay, let's jump to the mechanics of writing a grant. We have a few questions that came in. How to organize the outline?
Start this one. Your best friend is going to be your program announcement. Every opportunity will come with a funding opportunity announcement or program announcement. And so if you read every single line on that, somewhere in there, it'll tell you exactly what to put in the 4 pages or 6 pages. And one of you mentioned, it will also usually tell you what criteria it will be reviewed on. So you want to start by saying, these are all my required sections that I need to have in a grant. And that is different for an NIH grant or an NSF grant or a Ford Foundation fellowship, or in general, a fellowship grant. So you want to look through the funding opportunity announcement and make sure you definitely have everything that they ask for. And then comes all of this wordsmithing to make it, persuasive and be confident on paper. But the FOA is your BFF.
Yeah, I so agree with that. So one of the things that I learned from my PI was exactly that. Like it seems like a too simple to be true piece of advice, but yeah, reading through the thing. And one of the things, like I said, I learned from my PI Amy is usually there's a section where it's like you can just describe yourself, like it's your science, how you personally fit into your science, and then what you'll do with this money, and how you're going to be partnering with this funding source. And so one of the things that she does, because usually it's just a block of text, having titles. So like the first sentence of each of these paragraphs or sections will have an underline or a bold. So like that way they know, okay, this is where I'm looking for them as a person. This is where I'm looking for their science. And visually, it's really, really pleasing to see something like that, because it's broken up. Because again, there's probably 4 pages and they're going to be single spaced, and you don't want to torture your reviewer. You want to make it inviting for them to read. Like someone else brought up, they're reading 10 of these in a day, maybe more, and many, many more in the couple of weeks that it takes for them to review. Having it be aesthetically pleasing. So like for the outline, knowing where you're going to put this information, and these titles can change of your sections, but having an idea of where you're going to put kind of these bits of yourself into it and show yourself off can be a nice place to start. So that way, you're going to put your best foot forward in showing off your application.
I wanted to also say that, yes, like totally project announcement and the criteria that they're reviewed in the exact same order and in the exact same wording, because again, the reviewers are going down the list and checking off or scoring you on a 0 to 10 scale about how well you did in that section. And if they can't find a section, then if you're making them go to all the way to the end and it's like, oh, section B is actually, they decided to put it on the last page, like, no, that's not going to happen. They're not going to give you the scores. So follow that, the criteria and the structure that they're outlining for you in the program announcement. But I also want to talk a little bit about the language and the audience. So for example, if you're applying to an agency that says that their mission is to support historically marginalized students in STEM, then in your proposal, use that exact same language. Because if you're applying to another grant funding source that says that they fund minorities, like that's another language, right? So I would say try to mirror the language as much as you can to the language of the funding agency, because again, you're being aware of who your audience is, and you're trying to mirror your language to their language. If they're using first generation, right? Like, then that's a completely different kind of perspective on it. So I would go to the extent where make sure that when you're reviewing their mission, their vision for their program, when you're reading up on the agency, stay attuned to the type of language that they're using and try to mirror that as much as you can.
Awesome. Thank you so much for all this valuable advices. Our next question is, as a graduate student, one of the things that felt most intimidating and most mysterious was the budget making aspect of grant writing. Do you have tips on how to approach that?
I'll let everyone else give tips because I'm still intimidated by this aspect. And so I'm going to write down my notes.
I love that. I will say that Depending on your training level, you will want to work relatively closely with your advisor. And so in most of my experience, I did not originate the entirety of my project idea. So I would come to my advisor with, and sometimes it can be more approachable to have like 3 or 4 project ideas, right? And then like maybe you have 3 or 4 that you're really excited about, you've brainstormed them. And then you can go, your advisor's job is really to help you narrow down and kind of clarify the most strategic goal or project. And so over continual conversations with them, you can basically figure out how to narrow and or shape your project idea. So usually I would not recommend writing a project idea, depending on your training level, 100% independently. Because as Shreya already mentioned, it's a very challenging thing to do independently. And as we're training, usually you want people to help give you feedback and shape your projects. So usually if you're reading like the literature and know the literature in your field, you can propose, like I said, 3 or 4 project ideas, seek feedback and advice as you shape them and hone them into the project that will be in your proposal.
Yeah, so right. I am still very intimidated by it. Our oral and like a qualifying exam is basically writing an F31 type proposal. So you get that experience and hopefully can go forward to apply with it. But I asked my PI for current grants that she had already submitted and that were funded and that were basically supporting our side of the lab. And so being able to look at their references and just see like where in the scope of our science world are we oriented? What angle are we doing? And so at my second year is when lockdown happened for us. And it gave me a bit of a gift, which meant that I was forced to read, or like I couldn't come into lab. So I was going to use my time to read, and reading really helped shape like my whole second aim. That second aim was like not at all on my radar, was not anything that I was interested in doing. And I took that time to like read and explore other parts of the literature using my PI's grant as kind of my grounding point. And that definitely helped me to figure out a couple of different avenues of my project, and then took it to my mentor and said, hi, what do you think of these things during our meetings? And from there, this like bigger idea cloud that I had, we slowly were able to narrow it down into something cohesive and something that worked really well in a fellowship and in a grant thing. But nothing like that, I don't think should happen on your own. As much support, even like other graduate students in your lab, other postdocs in your lab that can be there to support you, they would be happy to, even if it's in the bullet point stages of progress. It doesn't have to be even full sentences, just like half-baked ideas. Communicating with others is so helpful. Elizabeth.
I would like to add, I'm trying to remember one of my first budgets was $3,000. It was like a small budget funded through UC-MEXIS. It funded my third year study. And it was a small funding source, and UC-MEXIS was very clear as to what the budget would entail, what is allowable and non-allowable. So they had it in the funding, in the announcement for proposals, if there should be some guidance as to what is allowable and what is not allowable. So for me, it was like basically travel to a conference, and usually that's allowed. Then it was like stipends for study participants, and it was like supplies and material to print out flyers, to print out surveys. So it was like, you know, a small budget of $3,000 in those 3 categories, right? Travel, supplies and material, and student stipends for people, to incentivize people to take my study. And so I would say my first piece of advice is read the call for proposals and see what is allowable and what's not allowable. If you are getting support from your advisor, or if you have an example of a previously successful proposal, look at their budget. But I would have to say, and now that I've seen multiple budgets and I've managed budgets with multiple funding sources, the categories are pretty much the same across like the funding sources. It's personnel, like salary and benefits, travel, supplies and equipment, and then there's like, you know, if you supplies and equipment, right? Like some of you are doing big experiments that are going to require maybe, you know, a lot of supplies, you know, stipends and incentives. So the categories are not very broad. There's probably like 5 or 6 major ones that you should keep in mind. But again, look at the funding agency and see what categories are allowable. Mm-hmm. And I could go into way more detail about that. I love budgets. I manage multi-million-dollar budgets now, and the categories, it goes back to what the federal agency. Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to add on the topic of budgets that it is intimidating, and a lot of times when you do start writing a grant or a fellowship that has a budget associated with it, like Erica said, it is your mentor's job to help you figure it out. But also you will get a ton of administrative support depending on where you are to help you think through your budget. Depending on the kind of grant and the kind of institution, you know, between you, your mentor, whether that's, you know, your advisor or peer mentors, and examples, there should be some administrative support that will also help you figure out best practices for a budget. So a budget decision is never, you know, it doesn't always just fall on you. And I think that trend continues as you go from a graduate student to a postdoc to a faculty position as well. There's a lot of support that comes into making your budget.
I also want to add, related to that, most campuses, if you are going to apply to a federal grant or something like that, those proposals need to go through an office of sponsored projects. And those are the people who, so again, that's the office of sponsored projects. It depends, the naming changes depending on the institution, but it's usually somewhat related to that title. And that's where, you know, you would get that support, where they would look at your proposal, look at your budget, offer by. So depending on the campus, but I know at UC Santa Cruz, when I applied to that UC Mexis grant, mini grant, I was required to pass it through the Office of Sponsored Projects, and they did offer some support as well with the budget making.
Thank you. Our next question, and I want to remind our attendees, if you have any questions to our speakers, please submit your questions via Q&A or chat. But here we have our next question. How many references are expected for grants? Is it different for each grant, or there's some general expectations?
I will say that this usually varies based on the grant. And it echoes some of our prior panelists' comments about just doing your background research and understanding the intricacies of each of those references. But what I love about this question is it kind of highlights something that's lesser discussed in terms of getting strong grant references, or getting people who will write very persuasive, powerful letters of reference for yourself. So one thing I always say is, like, it's good to have kind of mentors on notice if you're going to be applying for things. Ask them, do they have time to write a strong letter? I always put that directly in my email, because people will say, yeah, I have time to write you a letter, but it's not a good one, you know, like it's not going to be towards your benefit. So really try to be selective with people who have already shown an invested interest in your success. And then also, I would really try to encourage you to give your references lots of time and gentle reminder emails, follow up. You don't want your grant to be withheld. I actually have had several grants withheld just because one of my letters of reference did not submit. So everything else was submitted, but their letter. And so the whole grant got pulled. So it's on you to kind of follow up with your letters of reference writers. And then my very last pro tip about references is I actually usually give people an outline or draft bulleted list, or, you know, maybe a draft of what I want the letter to look like. It feels very awkward to write a letter on your own behalf, but most of the people who you're asking are overworked, did not set aside enough time to write you a very good letter. And so you want to lower the barriers of activation for them and basically make it as easy as possible for them to submit a great letter for you. So those are my comments about letters of references.
I just want to chime in and say all of that bold, underline, and italics, because it is very helpful. Each fellowship that you apply to will have different requirements for what they want to see in a reference letter. So if you rely on the person writing you a strong reference to actually read those guidelines and put that in your letter, I'm not saying people won't do it, but many people are significantly overworked, and it is something that is easy for them to overlook. And so it is in your best interest to create that bulleted list saying, here's what you need to highlight in this letter, and then give people time. So everything that Erica said, just bold.
Awesome. Just listening to you, it reminds me, we just closed the travel scholarships applications, and we're also requiring reference letters. The same advice applies to scholarships as well. It's on you as an applicant to follow up with your recommenders. Great advice. What are key resources you use in your process when you're writing a grant?
I'll start because we're all, oh, sorry, Alyssa, go for it.
No, I mean, I was really just going to highlight, I mean, we've kind of touched, thankfully, on like a few of these things of looking at other examples of things and looking at things that you've already kind of written or started on, just to emphasize like your own position and like, I'm applying for this. I can absolutely win this, like Elizabeth's confidence mantra, like you are a partner in my success. I'm not asking you for money. I think, yeah, those types of things, because it is intimidating to put together a whole proposal, especially something on the order of an NIH or the HHMI Gilliam, which just requires so many things. Starting out with places that you're already comfortable or already have resources can be an easier place to start. Again, like lowering that activation energy to get started.
I'll piggyback on that a little bit. Get yourself a hype person / friend who will hype you up, because mine is on this panel and she knows, because I don't automatically put that confidence on paper. But if you have good peer mentors or even a writing group that you do this together with, you're in it together. The other thing with resources, I might be a little old school in resources, but for me, I have the biggest issues curating everything that I read on a topic and then bringing it back together on a page. And there's lots of, fun new Twitter threads with tools for how to do that, but I still do the old school. I have like OneNote open with different tabs and different topics. And then anytime I find something interesting, even if it's a sentence or two that is a takeaway from that paper, I put that down and I have the reference. So when I go back to write a section and I say, I need to write about macrophages and mechanics, I can go back to that tab and then quickly read through and say, okay, so remind myself, these are the 20 papers that I read 6 months ago, but I know what the takeaways from those are. And so I come back and then I write, and that has helped me curate my thoughts a little bit more as I write. I won't claim that this is a very fancy method, but it has been a good resource for me to put all my research in one spot.
I was just also going to add, a hype person is very helpful, and accountability buddies. So like Shreya and I keep each other accountable for a lot of things, but sometimes because writing a grant can be so overwhelming, if you have someone, even if you just check in with them, and we've done like a 2-minute check-in and just been like, what did you do this week? Have you made any progress? Okay, those little tidbits kind of break down the intimidatingness or the intimidation factor and make it more approachable. Because then you have someone you can say, hey, I tried to do this week. It didn't really work out well. Did you try to do something that was similar? So then you're not the only person writing this proposal. You have someone who's like a buddy with you as you navigate it.
Yeah, especially since writing is so personal. And if it is like you're on Lonely Island with yourself writing this, it can feel like, I don't know, just like more overwhelming than it needs to. Yeah, so finding that support, I think, is really, really important.
Thank you. Quick reminder, we have time for just a few more questions, so please submit them in the Q&A. But our next question is, can a grant proposal ever be too ambitious? How to gauge degree of innovation that may be too ambitious, so the proposal is not scored low for not being doable? Elizabeth.
Yeah, I wanted to answer this question because yes, and I would say that most proposals are probably, I don't have empirical evidence to say this, but I would say that most people try to do too much. Not because not because it's like, oh, I can do too much, but I think that oftentimes we are in a researcher lens, right? From the research perspective, and we know that we want to uncover these new truths or be innovative with the research. But this is where the administrative side of me comes in. This is the praxis part, like the practical application of these ideas. Like when you convert these ideas to actual steps, the administrative steps, to somebody who knows the administrative back end of things, it's like, that's going to be a lot of work, right? And so what I always tell people is, yes, you could start with big ideas, but maybe you have a funding source for the first part of that idea, for a piloting phase, right? So instead of going directly to like, oh, I'm going to do a study of 3,000 students, like maybe start with a pilot of 1,000, right? Depending on the funding source and what they require, right? Because some funding sources do require very, very big projects. But yes, I think, and I think you can gauge whether a project is too ambitious also through the budget. Because if what you're trying to do is aligned with the budget, then you can kind of tell like, oh, well, so then how are you going to get that piece done if it's not in your budget, right? So I think you can do triangulation and start seeing, put your practical hat on and work on timelines, work on budgets, work on who's going to do that work. Is it just going to be you? Are you going to hire RAs, or how's the work going to be done? I think the practical aspect of things need to be, you need to have a thought partner in that.
Yeah, I was just kind of brought back, like the budget is such a great place to start because that's like also very practical. One of the things that I was kind of just reminded of when I was writing something, was I had this experiment of I'm going to design this new assay, and a graduate student, like one of my friends, just asked, what happens if like it doesn't work like the first time? Like, oh, I'll spend a couple of months optimizing it, something at the bench. I said, yeah, but what if it's not just one thing? What if it's like 3 or 4 things that need, the components that need to be optimized? And then, that kind of just brought into reality. Do I want to spend, I don't know, upwards of 1.5 years optimizing an assay that is just a small part of one of my aims? And so like, it's awesome to be ambitious and say like, I'm going to create something new and I'm going to like be the person that has this great new tech or assay. But yeah, having that kind of realistic check-in of things in biology often don't work the first or fifth time. And how much time do you want to spend in that if you are a second or third year PhD student? How much time are you willing to put into something before you move on to aim 1.2 or aim 2, something like that?
Yeah, I was just gonna expand on that a little bit. So there is this funny rule of thumb that I think is very helpful for determining how ambitious or realistic your proposal idea is. And if you take the time that you think it'll you think it will take you a 1 month to complete aim 1. In reality, it will actually take you 3 months to complete aim 1. And so people say like, take whatever estimate of time you've given yourself, multiply it by 2 or 3. And that's the reality of how long it will take you. And so then you can tell very quickly, like, oh, if I think I proposed 3 years worth of work, I probably proposed like 6 years worth of work, right? And then like figuring out how to pare that back to be a little bit more realistic and give yourself that wiggle room. Very rarely do people finish everything when they plan to do it. Like that does not happen. So just give yourself that wiggle room and then you can be a little bit more realistic with what you propose to accomplish.
Thank you, Erica, for that important note. And our last question for today, how do you cope with the rejections?
Great question.
I this is a small comment, and Erica, maybe you can continue, but I feel like I'm the opposite of Elizabeth, and I am grieving my rejection as I'm writing my proposal. Like which is not, admittedly, not at all a good strategy, but I am like, into my personal statement and, oh God, these people don't care. I am not at all a good applicant for this. I don't deserve it. I'm wasting their time just by writing this. So not healthy, but it is at least nice to be able to go through the reality of it's very possible that this won't make it. There are hundreds, sometimes even like tens of thousands of people applying for this certain pot of money. And so I start my coping process of rejection very early on. I don't know if anyone else has this.
I'll add to that. I'm a bioengineer, right? So I'm very data driven. So I love seeing success percentages. And I usually, when I find a mechanism that I want to apply for, I somewhat know what the previous funding success percentages are. And I would like to go in being not negative, but there's a lot of different factors that go into writing, right? There's imposter syndrome, like you're doubting yourself, are you good enough to do this? But I think the answer to all of that, even though you may not believe it, is yes, you're absolutely good enough to do this and you should do it. But the rejection is, I've taught myself this over the years, that it's not personal. It is not a slight on me. It does not reflect poorly on me. I have made my best effort to do this and to write. The fact that you're here today watching this or listening to this is you making an effort at writing a grant. So that is still a non-zero possibility. Anytime you put words on a paper and you send that across, non-zero possibility of being funded. So there's both sides to once you send your grant off, but none of it is, it's not personal. None of those reviews are a personal slight on you as a person. And you can use that to constructively rework another submission, is how I always try to approach it these days.
Yeah, I was going to add one thing that I spent a lot of time doing, and it doesn't always work, is changing my perspective around what is failure or what is a rejection. And so I think that like a lot of times we assume, oh, if I don't get awarded this grant, that is failure. And I'm challenging myself and sharing it with the audience here today to say, that is not failure? Like, what if we reimagined what failure is? Because the whole point of this, is to learn how to become a stronger writer, to learn how to write persuasively about your science, to communicate your science, right? Scientific communication, that's the bedrock of everything you'll do. So it's kind of just like in maybe in earlier training, like in pursuit of an undergraduate degree, you didn't have to win, or you didn't have to get an A+ on all of your exams to still get your degree. Right. And so that's like, it's like, you don't have to win all of the awards. You don't have to win every award that you apply for to still be successful in your PhD or whatever program you're in. And so that's something like, I think we need to work as a community to redefine what failure is, because in fact, you put together an amazing package, right? Amazing proposal, and you submitted it. That is a win. Right. And like, I think we often, well, I didn't get the money. It's like, okay, but that doesn't mean that all of the effort you put forward is for nothing. So that's one thing I try to do, like redefining failure and really focusing on the leading edge. What are you learning from each experience? That's the only thing that matters, right? Like, you don't have to get an A+ in every exam to still pass and get your degree. And the same is true for this.
I definitely agree with Dr. Moore. So in my scale of success, there is no failure. There's 3 categories. The worst case scenario is that now you have a proposal that you can submit somewhere else, right? And my colleagues have said that. The second one, if they give you reviewer comments, now you have free reviewer feedback that's going to make this proposal even better. So like, I mean, I think that's a win. Like, you just got 3 to 4 reviewers to tell you how you can improve this. That's amazing. And then the other success categories that you actually got funded, and right. So I think in those 3 scenarios, you're winning. And so I think that's what my colleague here was saying. So there is no failure. Go again, like some of these, these grants, you have to get an A+++ to get funded. So it's not, you probably don't have a bad proposal. It's just success rate is very slim. So yeah.
Thank you so much, all of you, for this wonderful discussion and for our attendees and for their questions. Let's recap some of the takeaways from today's webinar. Some great tips that we learned today about the grant writing. Write a persuasive proposal that tailors to the grant funder's vision and mission to have a better chance to be funded. When writing a budget, start with reading the funding agency's categories, what is allowed, what is not allowed, and so much more tips that you all shared today with our attendees. If you, let me share my screen real quickly. If you enjoyed today's discussion, you can find upcoming and previous webinars on our website at sacnet.org/webinars. Finally, immediately following this webinar, you'll be sent a survey that takes less than 30 seconds to complete. As members, your feedback is critical to us. So please take a few moments to submit the survey and let us know what you thought about today's webinar. Your feedback helps us improve as well as identify topics for future programs for you. This concludes our webinar with Elizabeth, Alyssa, Erica, and Shreya. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, and we will see you next time. Thank you to our speakers. Bye.
Thanks, guys. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.